First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today, and I'm super excited to be able to sponsor this event and in this section of this event because it's something that's near and dear to my heart. Disruption to me is the reason I'm here. And innovation is that what's driven that, and I'll tell you why. Because I think everybody in this room at one point or another, just like every business at one point or another, experiences some type of disruptive technology that comes along and changes the way you do business. And the companies and the people that don't innovate when that time comes die. And I personally had to do that in my career. I saw a disruptive technology coming along. It was an analog to digital transformation that I said, I've got to change the way I do business myself. And therefore, I took it upon myself to look at data and say, how does data impact my business, myself? And then it turned into the companies that I worked for. And at GIS Inc., we're doing that same thing. 2 years ago, I couldn't spell GIS. I came from an innovative technology group that said, we're looking at ways that innovation can expand businesses. And that's what I like to see in this group. And I'm excited about with this panel. And so that same mentality is around how do you take data and improve your business? And how do you embrace that data and that innovation and extend your business, the life of your business? And that's what's really exciting to me about that. GIS Inc. is doing just that. It's interesting, I was in a session earlier today and Jack said that GIS is becoming something from exotic to essential. And I'm super excited to be here, be part of this, because I see that. I see where it's coming from, the exotic to the essential. And that data and the visualization of that data is the key to that. And so I know Gary's put together a great panel for everybody, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say about how companies and organizations and individuals in this room can do just that. Take that disruption and really take the data from the disruption and innovate around that. I know at GIS Inc. we're doing that. We're innovating with our data. And Gary, it's your
all right. Thank you,
panel.
Brad.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so now I'd like to go ahead and call up our panelists. We have a really nice panel today. We have Gregg Katz, who's from the Shopping Center Group. Brian Kilcourse from RSR Research, which is one of the leading research companies that services the retail industry, and also Tyler Duncan, who leads the Dell's EMC Modular Data Center, helping to empower some of the horsepower basically that we need in order to be able to manage through some of the data that we're talking about. When we talk about, I want to kind of set this up. When we talk about the digital disruption, and for those of you who know me, my background is deep in the retail space. And I hear a lot of words about what's happening in business today, and the word apocalypse gets thrown around. And I hear just yesterday or sometime earlier this week I saw an article and from at least 4 or 5 different sources that the shopping center traffic was down to, there's a huge problem out there. And I just want to use parlance of the day. This is fake news, okay? And I want everybody to understand that. And I know we had a breakfast this morning, and I'm happy to say we were all in very violent agreement on that particular topic. But that doesn't mean that we're not in a period of disruption. There is change occurring. But the good news about change in business is that every time there is change, there are companies and there are organizations that are able to capitalize on that change and implement the strategies to be successful. And we're certainly seeing that now. And that's what we want to talk about today. So what I'd like to do first is start with Tyler, just really briefly give us a little bit of your background and about your company.
Yeah, so my name's Tyler Duncan. I work for a small little company called Dell. Our division of that is extreme scale infrastructure. I own software architecture for our modular data center business in that extreme scale infrastructure division. That division of Dell is something that we don't sell to the average consumer. We do custom solutions for large to very large customers. We don't advertise, we don't do anything like that. And if you took us outside of Dell, we would be our own Fortune 1 or Fortune 500 company.
Great, thank you.
So I'm Brian Kilcourse. I've been in or around retail for an embarrassingly long time. So since 1969, some of you might have gotten your first job in a retailer. I did. I just never left the industry. I got involved in the technology in the mid-'70s, in the days when all you had to do was express interest. So the joke I've told many times is if I fogged a mirror successfully, then I could get a job in IT. I was trained. I had a great career. I ended up being a CIO at a West Coast drugstore chain called Long's Drugstores, which is now part of CVS. And I left in 2002, and I advised technology startups in the Silicon Valley area, near where I live in California, mostly in the areas of mobility and now what we'd call IoT. It used to be called Auto ID. I became a CEO of a B2B media company in Boston in the mid-2000s, and that's where we started RSR. And what RSR does is we study the business use cases that drive technology adoption in retail. So that takes me right up to today. So
Great.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Greg?
Hi, my name's Gregg Katz. I am Director of Innovation and Technology with the Shopping Center Group. The Shopping Center Group is a retail real estate brokerage company, mostly on the East Coast. We have 20 offices, including one here in California. Background is very much in retail, and grew up as part of a family business which ended up selling out to service merchandise. So the early beginnings of a catalog showroom. So running up and down the aisles as a kid in these retail stores was especially around Christmas, was a lot of fun. So it kind of stayed with me, and moved into the real estate world and was a tenant rep, repping mostly restaurant, grocery, and a few other national chains for a while, and then moved into the data and strategy and innovation role of the Shopping Center Group about 7 years ago.
Great, thanks. Okay, so the first topic I want to approach is I just would ask you guys, because you all have a lot of coverage of the various markets that you operate on. I wonder if you could share some of the examples of the disruption that you're seeing and how customers are engaging differently with the companies that you work with, and also how some of the companies that you're working with are either changing or engaging differently with their customers. And let's start with Greg here.
Well, I think in a lot of cases what we're seeing is the digital going physical and the physical going digital. So somewhere in between, I think, is where everything's going to end up. But it's very interesting dynamic. You've got a lot of core brick and mortar retailers that are trying to better understand their customer, better understand their data, and leverage that to compete in a progressively e-commerce digital world. You've got the digital folks that have all the data and understand who their customer is to the T, where they're buying from, what they're buying, and have all of that, but have realized the need for a physical presence in a lot of cases. And so they're coming the other way, and they're trying to learn brick and mortar. So somewhere in between there, we're seeing a meeting point, and it's caused a big change in how we approach the business, because you're dealing with two very different dynamics. So we're having to try to pull both towards the middle ground as we deal with the data, the analytics, and the location analysis.
Yeah, one of the things, as you were describing that, I'm thinking from my own example. We know, for example, in our own customer groups, when I was in the retail world, that customers who engage only in one channel, so be it digital, mobile, online, versus customers that only engaged in brick and mortar are at two ends of a spectrum. But the ones who are actually engaged across all channels, which is sort of where this omni-channel, which I prefer unified commerce, really describes it better. But in that world, that those customers were 3 or 4 times more valuable to the organization than the outliers on any end. So really trying to get folks to do that, I think, is a win.
Absolutely, agree.
Brian?
Yeah, so it's interesting to point out, I think we all accept this as part of our daily lives. When you think about how consumers shop, they investigate a problem. We all investigate a problem, and then we make our selections based on our investigations. Then we pay for something, we take possession of it, and finally we consume it. And of course, let's not forget the last step. Then we talk about our experience. In the early days, and I would say the early days in this context is everything before about 2010. There's an important reason for that date. Everything that I just described was observable by and large in the store, in the 4 walls of the store. And so retailers really didn't have to think a lot about how consumers investigated. They investigated by walking the aisles, how they selected. We all knew how we did that, how we paid for it, how we took possession of it. Nowadays, I'm sure that every single one of you, I know I do this on a daily basis. I do at least 2 of those steps in the digital domain, beyond the gaze of the retailer. And so the retailer has lost control of that part of the dialogue, and consumers have taken control of it. The problem, of course, for retailers is that think about the consumer has the entire world at their disposal. They can check price, they can check feature, they read reviews all the time, they can do all of these things. And so the retailer has to figure out how to convert that into a physical experience, because at the end of the day, they have to exchange money for product. Right. That's what has to happen. And so retailers are really struggling with this. They really had no expertise before 2010. The reason 2010 is important is because the iPhone came out in 2007, and the Android came out in 2009, and by 2010, retailers said, uh-oh, we've got a problem. And that happened to be right in the middle of the Great Recession. So tying those 2 experiences, one that's a completely customer-centric and one that's completely product-centric, is a huge challenge, as you said, joining those 2 things together. Now, the other important thing is that consumers don't see channels. We use channels because it's convenient for us. It's how we organize our lines of business. It's how we organize our supply chains. It's all the things that we do internally. Spent my entire career focused on channels. But consumers only see a solution. Either you solve their problem for them or you don't. And so whether it's omni-channel or unified commerce, it's retail. It's what it is to a consumer.
Right.
It's a huge challenge for retailers.
I agree. Tyler, from your perspective, I know you're not dealing directly with the customer per se, but you have customers who are coming to you with, I imagine, we talk about engagement, we talk about data as being at the core of some of the, how the retailers are going to be able to connect all of these things that Gregg and Brian have talked about. Can you share a little bit about what you're seeing in the market from enterprises that are coming to you to try to, in terms of the size of the data sets and how they're trying to analyze that?
Yeah, excuse me. So, as you pointed out, our customers are not the average consumer, they're corporations. So it's your cloud providers, your online retail, banks, search engines, et cetera. What we're seeing is that we're in the middle of the next industrial revolution. We're, instead of adding power to devices, we're adding intelligence to devices.
Right.
And so we have smart cars, but now there's tons of data that comes along with that. And we have to be able to collect that, to be able to get it into centralized locations, which has its own challenges. So there's communication speeds. And then needing to be able to parse that out, get the right amount of information, and then be able to provide analytics back to the edge. So while for our business, in the past, we've been doing for, it's longer than I think probably, but 10 to 15 years, we've been making modular data centers that have been in large centralized locations. But now we're starting to get to where, because of 5G networks, faster communication speeds, because of more intelligent in-devices into the IoT and the industrial IoT, that we are starting to now need a lot more compute at the edge, and that's where we've been focused a lot, is being able to help our customers be able to put that solution at the edge, to be able to collect that data.
Interesting. So let me ask you guys this. So I've heard that the amount of data, when I talk to CIOs, and mostly in the retail space, I have yet to hear anyone say, we just don't have enough data. What I hear is, I've got a mountain of data, I don't know if I can get the right insights out of it. And we had a question to the panel earlier, and I know I've been evangelizing since I came to Esri about how location as a common join, where I can bring unstructured data from disparate sources together, is really kind of where the magic happens from our perspective in terms of driving engagement and finding the insights in that data, in that information, and being able to derive from that the strategies that I need to engage with consumers, because it feels like engagement is really essential. Brian, I know from you spend a lot of time talking to retailers about technology. Where do you see from a GIS perspective?
It's a great question. Well, first of all, to answer the first part of your comment, retailers have always had more data than they've had insight. It goes back to the very beginnings. I remember paying $1 million for 1 gigabyte of storage, this big giant IBM box. And I thought, wow, I'll never use all that data. And I just went down to Best Buy and I bought like 64 gigabytes. I think I paid $17 for it or something like that. But anyway, so retailers are always awash in data. It's insights, that's the problem. Retailers are struggling with the fact that the new data, the GIS data, which is very important to them for a bunch of reasons, is non-transactional in nature. So retail has always been a famously reactive business. The retail detects something happening in their market and they respond to it. And those responses used to be measured in months and then they're weeks and then they're days. But in this world, consumers expect responsiveness that's in near real time. The consumer detects a problem, they start searching for solutions, they want a retailer to say, I've got that solution for you. And retailers have to be able to reliably do that. Now that, in a lot of ways, breaks the model. When you think of the model that my generation of leadership built, it was always about highly standardized assortments delivered in a uniform way, presented in a uniform way to the consumer in the store, and you bought what we had to sell you. That's all there was to it. Consumers have absolutely revolted against that. They want something far more relevant to their lifestyle need. They don't want to be bothered with this other stuff. So you have to do a bunch of different things that you didn't have to do before. You have to be able to consume the early indicators, I call them digital breadcrumbs, that indicate what demand, how demand is being created.
Is it just demand, or do you see like I'm thinking about IoT and movement and
IoT is the flip side of it. You then have to bring supply to demand. It used to be that you brought demand to supply. You had no choice.
Sure.
You went to the store. But now in this new world, we have to bring the supply to the demand. So we have to detect it. We have to know where the supply is that can most reliably and most at the best profit be delivered to that point of demand. And that's a very, very different way of looking at the world.
It is.
So this is the fundamental challenge.
I'll be thinking about that.
You know, you putting this from a GIS perspective, probably 3 to 5 years ago, we kind of looked at the radius ring is dead. You start looking at like a 1-3-5 mile radius ring, or you even start looking at a 10-minute drive time or 20-minute drive time. And so then you're under the assumption that everybody in there is your customer. I mean, if you're running data off of that, then you're saying, okay, in this 10-minute drive time, these are all customers. Well, maybe they are, maybe they're not, right? Maybe they're coming from 20 miles away. Maybe they're work here but live somewhere else. And so I think we found 2 very key things. One is we found that most retailers do not know who their customer is, really do not know who their customer is. They think they do. But then we start looking at the mixture of the art and the science, and as you get more definitive on who your customer really is, understanding movement, understanding flow and path to purchase, and all of that stuff, as you really understand that, it kind of wipes away the generalities. And so, I mean, it's simple for, I'll put it from a real estate perspective, it's simple for a shopping center, a mall, whatever, to say, look at the income in my area, look at the population in my area.
Yeah.
Great. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't at the end of the day, because that those people may or may not be trading in that center. So again, I think having a lot of data, but it's also having the wrong data at a lot, or focusing on the wrong data. It's there, but you need to really start looking at it. And then there's an art to some of this too. I mean, there is the science of the data, you can't take away from that and the efficiency of it, but there is an art to this as well. I mean, we tell people, you want to know your customer? Go to the grocery store, go to the parking lot. See if there's oil spills in the parking lot. It tells you how well they're taking care of their cars. Walk the produce, see what types of produce are there, right? Look at the meats. You can see by the types of meats, is there ethnicity in the marketplace, is there not? By how they take care of their cars, you get into income, things like that. So you can, the data is important, but there's also a piece of the boots on the ground that makes a difference.
Makes sense. But let me ask you this. So that's one tactic, and I can see your retail because I know exactly what you're talking about. But from a data management, so when I have 1,700 stores, what sort of techniques do you think are applicable to be able to find those demand signals or find those outliers? And what technologies have you seen out there that help retailers to do that, or anybody in the commercial space?
Sure. Well, it's interesting. This is where AI comes into play. Retailers are right now where we are is retailers are having a little bit of an allergic reaction to the buzzword AI or machine learning. And so I try not to use those phrases if I can, but instead talk about data analysis techniques that allow retailers to detect patterns. Now, let's deal with a couple of realities, first of all. One of the things that we need to recognize is that every purchase is not the first time a consumer has made that purchase. We do a lot of repeat purchases. So it's important for people to recognize that depending on what your value proposition is, perhaps it's food, you're dealing with food in a certain community, you're going to sell different food than in a different one.
Yep.
And a lot of those are going to be repeat. So understanding the patterns that drive a consumer to a purchase are really important. And then there's the flip side of it is, think about what the marketing person is doing. They're trying to bring eyes and feet to the brand. And so the higher you move up if you will, the need pyramid, you're getting to things that are truly about self-esteem and those kinds of things. They get more and more individualized, and the value proposition gets more and more complex. So understanding how consumers are interacting with the messaging that you're giving them with the objective to get them to experience the brand becomes really important. It's all about AI.
Let me take this a little different course, because what you're talking about, what I'm hearing from a capability standpoint, is the ability to quickly recognize patterns. And I think that applies no matter what your market is. So if I'm an insurance and I'm looking at risk, being able to quickly identify the patterns in my data spatially that might be impacting my locations. Right. If I'm in the real estate market, it's understanding the locale and what might be the potential for it. And retail, we want to change our assortments. I'd ask Tyler, I also hear speed and being able to do this quickly. And tell me a little bit from a tactic standpoint, how can I make sure that my company is the fastest when it comes to being able to get the right insights out of this, tidal wave of information and I don't know what the right triggers are. So I need to be able to use some of these technologies like AI and machine learning to be able to find what's important.
Well, excuse me. For us, there's a few different things. Some of the first pieces of it is actually being able to make sure that you can actually put the compute where it needs to be, making sure that you're operating that efficiently and everything else. For us, the AI piece of it is something that we can help our customers do, but it's really a lot more for us on the operation side of things. And then enabling them to be able to take data and to make better business decisions for them. We don't want to be in the business of running our customers' businesses, but trying to do everything that we can to simplify their infrastructure and their costs so that they can focus on their business.
Very good.
I was going to say, the interesting thing about what he just said is that they're throwing off all this data, and it comes from the operational environment. Some of it's interesting, some of it's not. But without some examination very close to what I characterize as the first level of aggregation, you can't know.
Right.
So you have to have something that will say, this is an important signal to you. Do something with it.
Yeah.
And that's where the new intelligence comes in play. One of the things I was thinking of is one of the challenges that retailers have is they don't have staffs of data scientists hanging around.
Right.
The joke that we tell at RSR is there's a great concentration of data scientists in Bentonville, Arkansas, and Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Yes, there is.
I can't imagine why, right?
Yeah.
But for the rest of retail, there's a paucity of talent there. So one of the challenges that solutions companies have is creating the capabilities that the retailers need that can be manipulated by common mortal men and women. They can by business people or by what I used to call myself a brown bear data processor, somebody who just was a fairly normal intelligence and fairly normal training.
Yeah.
And this is one of the big challenges that technology firms have now in helping retailers to address these things. So there's two things: getting the right data to the right person at the right time, and then having the analytics in place that can make sense of it quickly and send the signal to the appropriate person.
And speaking the same language.
Yeah.
To your
Exactly
point,
right.
I mean, it's all this data is out there, and I think you were right. Machine learning, AI, all of these buzzwords, to me, they're very confusing in the retail world because, in any world, in a lot of respects, because everybody's got a little bit of a different definition of how they leverage it, how they use it, what it is. And I think it gets confusing, and then everybody feels like they have to do it to compete, but then they really don't understand why they're doing it anymore. It gets lost in it gets lost in the competition, right? And so it goes in circles.
Let me dig into that a little bit. So we know that being able to manage this data, obviously there's a lot of it, and GIS has a role to play there in terms of being able to find those signals, and localization is important in this. Gregg, I know some of the work that you guys have done has been remarkable in terms of, and I want to talk about this sharing. We talked about looking, in one of the previous examples this morning, there was some discussion about data and presenting it in forms of a table versus getting information. I think it was Steve from Belron who mentioned, don't underestimate showing things in a map. And it made me think of we were sort of, another colleague of mine was using this term, visual data mining, right? So being able to take data and take these various layers and put them on the map. Can you, Gregg, expand a little bit on what sorts of success you guys have seen from, because you do some fantastic visualizations, and what that has done to sort of raise the overall awareness in your organization and with your customers about what's going on within their marketplaces and why visualization is important?
Well, we call it telling the story, right? And
Sure.
So we have about 450 retailers that we represent, another 450 landlords. So we literally have to tell 900 different stories plus the internal, so another 200 people. So, there's 1,000 plus different stories going on here. Everybody wants to see things differently and understand things differently. So GIS and maps, I agree with what was said earlier. They're a great way to tell a story, to visualize something, and going back to the data and the confusion in the data, it's a great way to simplify that data and make it so that whether it's the CEO or whether it's an operations manager, whoever can quickly look at something and grab what they need out of it. We work very, very hard to, and in all honesty, 7 or 8 years ago when we first started with Esri, I think it was one of the things that Esri was kind of taken aback a little bit because I don't think they'd seen anything like us. They kept saying, we'd have a problem, and they'd say, here's the solution. We come back and say, that helps us for this client. We have 900 others that this doesn't work for. And I think, understanding how to uniquely tell the story through a map it's actually an art as much as a science, and it's critical, especially with all of the data that's coming out now, because it can get very confusing, get very fast. And I think that's where a lot of consultancy kind of fails, as people come in and they love to drop spreadsheets and reports and data down and say, okay, here's the solution to all your problems, and everybody's going, what? It's a stack this big, and what do I do with it? So
Sure.
I think the maps can start helping you, get to conclusions a lot quicker.
Tyler, your customer is quite different, but we talked a little bit about some of the work that you also were finding helpful to reach them. Can you maybe expand a little bit on how that's helped from your, because I don't want to say exactly B2B, it's B to giant B, but how have you been able to use that?
Well, so for us, some of the things that we're doing as far as with the data and especially with the GIS piece is being able to, one, display a customer's entire enterprise on a map for visualization to be able to understand the health of that. And in our case, we're talking about lots of data centers and small data centers where the data center may be, more of an appliance. So by being able to visualize all this on a map, understand the health, also understanding that if I have much smaller pieces, then I need to be able to help manage my workforce on how I manage repairs. And the more efficiently I can do that, the lower I can keep my operational cost. The next piece gets into the next level of analytics and being able to say things about taking advantage of the fact that I have a dispersed enterprise now, the dispersed computing, that if I have a failure over here, I can actually move workload over to other locations. And if the more intelligently I can do that, the more efficiently the more cost effectively I can have each data center. So one key example of that is to be able to, if I have a failure, and to be able to say, I know I'm running on a battery backup right now. What do I need to do? I need to move that application. I'm going to look at latency to surrounding areas. And then I may also be looking at, why did I lose power on my location in the first place? Is it a storm? I'm tracking the path of that storm and weighing that into my analytic to know where to move my applications. So the more effectively that I can do all that, and I can visualize that, then the lower I can keep my cost and the more efficiently I can run.
So in my mind, I'm thinking dashboard, just to simplify it, and serving up real-time streaming data from a dashboard. Brian, have you seen, like in the retail world, an application from in terms of, it's certainly going to lead to a speed to a decision quickly?
Right. Well, there's a bunch of ways you can look at this. From the highest level of thinking about picking a location, retailers are examining their locations for all the reasons that Esri understands very carefully. But they're also looking at places to forward position their inventory for non-store fulfillment. They're looking for store-based fulfillment of e-commerce orders, those kinds of things. You're starting to see dashboards that help store managers manage that. But getting inside the box, it's even more interesting. For example, retailers are starting to understand where the traffic flows are, think of the use patterns for the physical stores. Consumers still overwhelmingly go to stores. And it should be enjoyable, right? But the property inside the box is still very profitable. So you know this from your days as a retailer. Some end caps are worth more than others. And if you're selling a hot new product, you want it on the best end caps for a bunch of good reasons. And that may change from time to time, maybe even daily. So these are the kinds of things that new analytics can help store managers understand. It may help them understand simple things like, you're blowing through a promotional product faster than your forecast had expected, and you need to find the secondary location so you can move that stuff forward. Now, that might seem like a very simple problem, but that's an IoT use case that could drive adoption. These things are all important. Dwell time for consumers, time to service, all of those things are interesting to retailers.
In terms of bringing engagement strategies, or how am I translating that to?
Yes, in terms of, think of it this way. Instead of the store manager being the guy who manages the box in terms of the cash and getting the product out to the aisle, think of the store manager as the chief customer engagement officer for that physical location. What does that do to that job? And what kind of information do you need to bring to make that person successful in that job?
So Greg, I would ask sort of the same from your perspective in terms of the dashboarding and real-time data streaming as a capability to help manage through this disruption. How do you see that applied in your space?
I think for us, we as a company have been asked to more, as time has gone by, to do more and more analytics as it gets into finding locations, and then it even gets beyond that, because then you start getting into, if you're going to find location, you got to know who your customer is, and we're spending an awful lot of time creating, and in essence, as close as we can get to real-time dashboarding or again, going back to mapping, telling the story and providing it in real-time live maps and things of that nature, where they can start looking deeper than just the demographics and kind of the store-based data. And we get into, not only do we do a lot with consumer movement and GPS and that type of data, but then we're getting into which Esri is a great tool for. We're getting into the personality of the customer, right? So
Sure.
it goes. We've just like the trade areas have changed dramatically. I think demographics have changed dramatically as well. It's, if we both make $50,000 a year, how you spend it and how I spend it are going to be very different. So again, saying we need $50,000 average household income, it doesn't really tell you the story, right?
Right.
So I think, but saying you need $50,000 average income because this person, drives a Volvo, likes to shop at Whole Foods, is athletic and mountain climbs on the weekends. If you can start describing a customer that way, then it kind of changes the game. So we've gone from 5 to 7 years ago talking about here's the 1 mile, 3 mile, 5 mile, here's, they make 50,000, they're college educated, and the population of the trade area is X, to all of this other stuff. And it's being asked for frequently, often, and as real time as we can get it. So it's a big change.
So it's interesting. And when I'm thinking along the lines of segmentation. And one segmentation, and correct me if I'm wrong, drives engagement. Right, we employ segmentation strategies to understand customers better so that we can give them the offers and the products and the things that they want, hopefully building loyalty and keeping them within our own ecosystem. They don't feel like they have to shop anywhere else. That's from a retail's perspective. At the same time, if I'm in other businesses, understanding who my customers are and what their specific needs are. If I'm putting financial products out there, I want to make sure that if I have a branch that's in a neighborhood with retirees, that I'm not offering college loans or things like, what am I stressing, and understanding that. But what about now being able, it's one thing to identify who your core customer was, and I think every business that has customers spends some time from a marketing perspective trying to understand that. How do I now take that and actually find them within a geography? And how do I build the right trade area to be sure that I'm capturing the right people and the right market area so I can improve my chances for that engagement? And I'll start with you, Gregg.
For us, it goes back to movement, and it goes back to how consumers move throughout the day, where they go, what they do, why they do it, and understanding that movement to therefore. The best example is, you can have basically a bedroom community, a residential area that's got a, grocery anchored center, let's call it, right there, and then maybe another power center right next to it. So it's got, a decent amount of retail right at that intersection. But during the day, maybe like a vacuum, everybody may get sucked out because they go to work and they take their kids to school and then go to social events outside of that area. So day part, looking at day parts, understanding movement, understanding everything that's happening becomes critical. I can't stress enough how much it's evolved to what we were looking at maybe 7-10 years ago. When I was during my brokerage days, it was very cut and dry what you would look at. Pre-recession, it was, and it was a lot of gut. Oh, that looks great, let's go for it. That's an intersection, we can do it. There's no stopping us, we'll open another location. I think now not only is it much more selective, but from a consumer standpoint and an engagement standpoint, understanding all of that and pulling the right data and mixing all of that data together to give you the right analysis is key.
So from a geography standpoint, from what you've described, we're actually, and also Brian, you had mentioned earlier the end of the one size fits all assortment, right, is that we're now getting more precise in how in what our messaging and what our approaches are, right?
Yeah, the more the more you widen that, the harder it is to be successful, right? It's everybody goes back and says, why did McDonald's ever just stop making just hamburgers and fries and that core business? And I think as you go and you try to become everything to everybody because either you're scared of competition or you feel like you have to address it from a shareholder perspective or whatever, you lose sight of who's that core customer, what's made you successful, and over time, I think if you keep that in mind and understand where they are and how they do things and how they move, and just stay focused, it makes a huge difference.
I'm going to ask Tyler to take a little different perspective on this. And we talked at breakfast a little bit about, and we talked here a little too about getting decisions right to the edge. And how do you see from a distributed model? Are you getting any discussions with your enterprises about how this processing happened, or how they're able to get out into the, down to a very low level of granularity and do things right in the market?
Yeah, well, so for us, working with our customers, I think it changes a little bit based off of the vertical. But, for some of our customers, they have lots of land. Telecommunication companies have lots of land, or they have access to it. There's hundreds of thousands of cell towers around the world, so they have access to that. It's just being able to get a service out and then be able to have a communication speed that actually helps to be able to do the applications that are needed. So if I've got AR glasses and I need to be able to have a near real-time response, managing that. But and I think that's a lot of it. Latency is one of the key things that's driving that to get out to the edge, that movement. Another key one is just remote aspects. For a different vertical is looking at, say, oil and gas verticals. Mm-hmm. They may need analytics to be able to increase their production, but it's at a very remote location where it's really not a latency issue at all. The latency is infinite. So, I don't know, it kind of changes a little bit based off of the vertical, but they have the need to increase the performance of their business. And
do you see across vertical any sort of patterns emerging on what successful organizations are able to execute against?
I think a lot of it is when we start talking about especially moving compute to the edge.
Yep.
I think that it's actually a relatively new thing, and I say that, and these two guys will disagree because there's been compute in retail at the edge for a long period of time. But to be able to do a lot of the newer things, the self-driving cars, the telecommunications, the AR glasses, the big data analytics at the edge, to be able to, all these things that I've been mentioning, I think it's actually relatively new as far as how corporations are trying to do things. And for us, a lot of the things that we see is a lot of POCs and trying to figure out what that is. We're not trying to tell anybody what the right solution is. We're trying to help them through that journey and work with them on that, and we'll get there.
Very good. Okay, so I'd like to now, as we're starting to get toward our time, talk. If you guys wouldn't mind, I'd like to know. I mean, one thing that I'm also hearing is that companies that are nimble and can adapt change seem to also be rising to the top of the. I mean, we see some legacy companies that they either haven't adopted or bought into some of the new data strategies that are out there. They haven't really identified this trend that we've heard about being, more local, more precise. And these are probably companies that are struggling today. And yet we have some great examples across all of our different verticals of companies that are doing really, really well but they tend to be companies that move fast. Am I on track there, Brian, or where am I?
That's true. Again, going back to the retail model, it's a reactive model, and it's actually a very slow model, or it has been a very slow model. It was all about bringing product to market in the lowest unit cost of goods, and then selling that through. That's how it worked. And people like me have spent and you too, have spent our entire careers figuring out how to do that. But the assumption was always that the consumer or the demand came to supply. In this new world, you have to bring those two things together in a different way, and that demands a couple of things. It demands, first of all, that you understand how demand is created and how it decides, almost how it decides to start moving towards supply. And then you have to bring supply closer to it somehow, that point of demand. The problem is it breaks the economics of the traditional retail model. And you think about how retailers make money. I don't know how many of you are retailers, but those who are not in the industry would be surprised perhaps to know that a good retailer, for every dollar that they put in the register, they might be able to distribute 2 to 3 pennies on that dollar to their shareholders. It's a remarkably brutal business. And so all of these, anytime you touch inventory, you're adding cost to that model, and you're taking away the ability to pay your shareholders or your owners. And the other thing that we all know, I think, intrinsically about retail is that labor in the stores has been screwed right down to the floorboards. So consumers are demanding a new level of service.
Yeah.
What's happening, of course, is that consumers are serving themselves with information. So it's important to understand for retailers what those paths to purchase are that consumers are engaging in, and how to most profitably bring supply to those people without breaking the financial model. It's a really interesting challenge, but it's not something that's going to be easy. And what's getting in the way of that, of course, is that every single system that you and I implemented in retail is about record keeping. It's not about quick response.
Right.
And so we're talking about a whole new generation of technologies that retailers have never had to deal with before.
Well, let me ask this now, so we can, as we wrap. For each of you, I would be interested if we've talked about the importance of being able to manage through data, and we talked a little bit about how GIS and location specifically can help to facilitate some of those insights and bring things that I don't think are available any other way. We talked about some real-time streaming of data and how to bring speed into the enterprise in order to make decisions faster. We did do a little bit around the segmentation and higher precision in the geographies within we operate in, really all around engagement and building customer engagement models that that are keeping customers within our ecosystem. To close, I would ask each of you, and we'll start with you, Gregg, since you're closest to me. If you were to give advice to the group here, and specifically from our survey results, those who are we're starting to figure this out, and we're trying to manage through, and we see the impact of the disruption. What tactics would you offer them, and where should they focus their resources in terms of navigating through this?
I think there's a saying out there: the more failures you have, the more successful you are. And I think at the end of the day, I think the data and being quick to get the data and whether it's real time or as close to it as real time, that's all great. But I still think the biggest thing that's going on right now is there's a disconnect between the data and being able to explain it, to turn it into something actionable. And I think that's probably the key right now. I mean, we see it in our business. I mean, we're not only having to take a step back as we deal with retailers and landlords, but we're having to take a step back as we deal with our own internal brokers and executives, et cetera. So I think it's one thing to show the data and use, and whether it's on a map or any other way, but I think it's another to explain it in a way that everyone can understand. And I think that's kind of, to me, where we are right now, is that everybody, again, these buzzwords, machine learning and AI and all this other stuff that's out there, I think it's confusing and it leads to everybody making their own assumptions. So I think that's where I would give advice, is just make sure the explanations are there and that it's done in a way that everybody from soup to nuts can understand everything you're talking about.
Thank you. And Brian, I would add, you mentioned, you accused me of implementing systems, but I would add being able to pass that information to operational systems,
right,
and help. So I would propose the same question for you.
Well, the very first thing that RSR typically recommends to retailers is ask yourself the question: what do you want the customer to experience? How do you want the customer to experience the brand?
Great question.
There's an assumption that's kind of built into the way retailers build their businesses, that the consumer will come to the store to experience the brand. But what do you really want them to experience? And then without wearing rose-colored glasses, ask yourself, how good are you at delivering that experience? That's usually a real, let's call it a deep moment for retailers. Then the next question that I typically would put to them is, what data do you have? And that's when the surprise, the light bulbs are going off. So for example, if there's a CMO, you'll discover that the CMO has a lot of data, way more than he or she is actually using. And they might be working with agencies, they might be working with all kinds of outside entities. And just to get a sense of what kind of data you're really working from. And then this is where it gets a little bit fuzzy, but I've recommended many times to retailers that they start working with an outside service provider of some kind to start experimenting with the data.
Yeah.
One of the problems with data, and it was always the hardest thing to come up with an ROI analysis of any kind of data analytical capability, was that the company didn't know what it didn't know. And if you ask for an ROI analysis, you're taking the safe bet, the things you're already aware of. So to break through that, I would recommend working with an outside service provider of some kind to ask new questions, to discover new things. And that might help you to define better how you're delivering your brand value to your consumers. And it would lead to some interesting questions like, are my stores in the right places? Is my supply chain built properly? Am I creating the right kind of digital experience that will draw them into the brand value? Those kinds of things. But that's usually where I start with retailers.
Thank you. Tyler, from your perspective?
Yeah, so the thing that I always look for and try to encourage our customers with is standardization. And, I look at the telecommunications industry, and I can't speak for all central offices because there's a lot of them out there, but there's a lot of them that are unique. And because they're unique, it makes it more difficult to manage the global enterprise. When everything is unique, I have to manage at a smaller level. If it's standardized across, then I can look at managing, being able to push updates, do things to future-proof everything that I'm doing. I think from a data perspective, it's the same thing on standardization. If I can make the data agnostic from and I'm speaking from a hardware perspective here, but I don't want it to be my data to be associated with a particular brand or model of device anymore. I want it to be agnostic so that if I have a UPS, an uninterruptible power supply, that the units are always the same. I basically have the same amount of decimal points. I'm calling it the same thing. I don't call the line side power on one to be line side power another power line. Or put an underscore or abbreviate things. That the more that I have that standardized across all my data sets, then my analytics can actually start to get smaller.
Sure.
The example I gave earlier of that if I lost power on compute and I want to make a decision off of that, if I have 10 things here, 10 different names for that or 10 different versions of that same one data point, and then the decision is that data point over here is actually also 10 different versions. Now I have 100 different versions of that analytic. So standardization should help everything be more future-proof, be easier to maintain, easier to manage.
Great. All right, well, we've come to the end. I would tell you on behalf of the entire commercial team here, thank you, all three of you, very much for agreeing to participate. You guys are great.